All right, this is Cybersecurity, What History Teaches Us. And this is Naina. Why don't you take it away?
You're on mute.
Lovely. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm going to talk about what we can learn from history about cybersecurity. And whenever we talk about cybersecurity and what has happened so far, we tend to focus a lot on the breaches that have happened and what's happened with different hacks, but not so much on other aspects. So I was hoping to spend the next 10, 20 minutes with you talking a little bit about what are some of the other things that we should think about as cybersecurity professionals. And I have only 20 minutes to do this. So I've requested our moderator to give me a warning when it is 15 minutes past scheduled time. We may not have time for a lot of questions, but I do have a feeling that you may disagree with me on some of what I'm saying and what I'm focusing on. So if you feel strongly about things, please feel free to write it in the text box, and the moderators will pick that up going forward. I think, moderator, there's a raised hand already. I'm guessing you will look at that. So those of us who are interested in cryptography might argue that cybersecurity and the history of cybersecurity started as soon as people started writing. So if someone's written something, that by itself is probably something which is unintelligible to someone who can't read. Or one might argue that it maybe started with things such as ciphers. So Julius Caesar started using ciphers very early on, and maybe that's when the history of cybersecurity started. But for the purposes of this discussion, I want us to focus on the more recent history of cybersecurity. And we may want to see what happened in the 1970s. So in the 1970s, a guy called Bob Thomas wrote a program. And it was on the ARPANET, which was the precursor to the internet. And what happened was he wrote a program which would just go around from terminal to terminal writing, I'm the creeper, catch me if you can. And that's all that it did, right? And another guy called Ray Tomlinson picked it up. Now, Ray Tomlinson, for those of us interested in more of the tech history, is the guy who also developed email. So he picked this piece up and he made it self-replicating. And so the first ever worm was born. And then he also wrote a program which would go after the creeper and just delete it from the terminals. And he called it the Reaper. And that was the first antivirus or, cybersecurity software, so to speak. But it wasn't until the 1980s that the criminal aspect of looking at cybersecurity came about. So in 1986 was the first instance of a cybercrime. So a guy was looking at how he can enter the computers of the US military. And so he used a university network and then jumped onto the military network, allegedly to sell some of those bits of information to foreign governments. And for the first time, we realized that, hey, this needs some kind of law around it. So it can't go on without law. So the first Computer Fraud and Abuse Act came up in the 1980s. Now, if you think about the world in the 1980s and what it really was like, in the 1980s was when Microsoft first launched MS-DOS, and IBM actually created the first PCs in the early 1980s. So this is the kind of world that we're talking about, right? And there was just a trickle of malware as well. By the time we reached the 1990s, malware was in the tens of thousands. And this was the time when, as cyber professionals, the tools in our arsenal were not that evolved. So we were highly dependent on antivirus. And how antivirus worked was through knowledge. So they would look at things such as signatures and say, hey, does this look like something I'm aware of? Does it look like something I should be concerned about? And then remove it from computers. And by the early 2000s, cyber was still largely about compliance, although the number of malware samples had jumped. It had gone from tens of thousands to something like 5 million malware samples, so which was a big jump in the number. 1995 is also quite important in terms of how cyber professionals or cybersecurity or cyber criminals were being portrayed in the media. So what was happening around this time was in 1995, there was a movie that came out called Hackers. And some of you may be familiar with the movie. The movie starred Angelina Jolie. And it was a story of a few young hackers, and they were seen wearing hoodies. And that's when this whole image of cybersecurity is about people in hoodies, which has now become about men in hoodies, came about. And it also featured something called the Morris worm, loosely based on the Morris worm, which is also something that had happened in the 1980s. And it was when a guy called Morris, whose first name I now forget, um, created the first ever worm on the internet. And the issue with that worm was when people started looking at how much has this cost us, they looked at it and said, hey, it could have cost us anything between 100K to 10 million. And what we learned from that is, and we're still learning, is that it's very difficult to estimate the cost of a cyber breach. So numbers still vary, and we still struggle when someone says, hey, how much investment should we have in this particular cybersecurity problem? We can't really put a finger on it and say, this is what we think it costs, and this is what we think they should invest. So this was largely what was happening between the 1980s, 90s, and 2000. But the most recent history of cybersecurity is when things became really, really interesting. So Forrester calls it the decade that cyber went mainstream. And in the last 10 years, so much has happened in the history of cybersecurity. And there's so much that we can learn from it that it's the most interesting bit to look at. So 2010 to 2012. This was the time when the financial crash had just happened. And there was not a lot of money being spent on technology or on cybersecurity. But a few fundamental shifts were happening. And the fundamental shifts were around the fact that the traditional boundaries of the organization were disappearing. So suddenly, cloud computing was a thing, social media became very commonplace. And the third thing was also the use of bring your own devices. Now, as consultants, when we were going into organizations at this point to advise on cybersecurity or to work on cybersecurity projects, it was mostly about setting the baseline. How do we write the policies for something like cloud? So there was the first time when people were thinking about how would use a use case policy change? How would we put policies around data leakage protection? And if you look at how things shifted between 2010 to 2012, that is very interesting as well. So around 2010, and the source I'm using is the EY Global Information Security Survey, which is available online and in public domain. About 50% of the people in 2010 were saying, we will be moving to cloud. And if you look at the same survey in 2011, 61% of the respondents said that they had already moved to cloud. So this was a massive change, and it happened really, really quickly. So we had to change as cybersecurity professionals, and we learned that our traditional mindset of thinking about cybersecurity as building a fortress would no longer work. So when we now think of it and think, hey, that's kind of obvious, we actually haven't been thinking of this for a very long time. It's something that's recent. It's something that has happened only in the last few years. And around this time, cybersecurity was also gaining in prominence because there were more attacks, and even Barack Obama noticed. And the problem we had before when we went to organizations and said, hey, this can happen, is that people would tell us, no, this kind of thing doesn't happen. We haven't seen it. We haven't heard of it. But this was becoming real by 2012. And Obama wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal, and he called it Taking the Cyber Threat Seriously. 2013. I've left this year by itself because I think it's one of those pivotal years in the history of cybersecurity. By this time, cybersecurity incidents, cybersecurity hacks, cybersecurity breaches were making the headlines almost every week. So you look at this year and you see you can no longer deny that cybersecurity incidents happen. This is a real threat. If you look at the same survey, and I'm only using this as a shorthand, all other surveys will probably give you similar indications. But by this time, about 75% of the respondents of the same survey said that they had asked an external organization to have a look at their cybersecurity posture. And surprise, surprise, what do those assessments reveal? All of those assessments revealed that we don't have enough budget for cybersecurity. So this was a problem in 2013, and it still continues to be a problem in 2020. Also interesting to note is around this time, less than 20%, so 1 in 5 organizations felt that their cybersecurity team was equipped to deal with the problems that they were seeing on a day-to-day basis. But this was the fundamental point when we began to think of cybersecurity as when, not if. So the whole mindset around cybersecurity had changed in 2013. And another very interesting thing that happened in 2013 was Edward Snowden came into prominence, and suddenly insider threat became something that people had to take seriously. So 2014 to 2016, a lot of companies said that they started investing in not just incident response, but also business continuity and disaster recovery. And around this time, there were also quite a few prominent third-party related breaches. Traditionally, a lot of the financial services organizations were the only ones focused on third parties and what they were sharing and what they were doing. And with 2014 to 2016 timeframe, that began to change. So third-party security became something that people really wanted to invest in. And it also became clear that the issue with hackers and the amount of influence that they can have. So we're talking about hackers, what they were doing and how they were doing things. It was becoming front page news, but it was always about, are they trying to just do a prank? Are they looking at stealing information which they can sell? But it was still a little bit more localized than what it became in 2016. So in 2016, the Democratic National Committee was hacked. And for the first time, people began to realize that, hey, it's possible that cybercrime can actually affect even things such as national elections. It can affect who we are voting for and completely change the course of history. By this time, cybersecurity was becoming really hard to miss, right? And we started seeing more of cybersecurity on TV. So 2015 was the year when Mr. Robot hit the screens, as well as I think there was another show called CSI Cyber. I haven't watched either with a great deal of attention, but I think it's fair to say that Mr. Robot is probably a closer depiction of cybersecurity than CSI Cyber. However, the whole notion of the cybersecurity person as a man in a hoodie is still persisting. You still see the main character in Mr. Robot wearing a black hoodie, and that's his uniform. So, yeah, we are on TV, but we still have the same things being said about us. 2017, staying on the same theme of how we were viewed in the media. Cyber attack even featured in the finale of Grey's Anatomy, and that's a picture of it's a screenshot from the show. But basically, it showed that the computers were sputtering, and then that they died, and it was a big problem, and they were depicting ransomware. And although it was not a very realistic portrayal, but the whole point about something like this has a big impact on our ability to deal with our customers, or in this case, with patients with life-threatening situations, was becoming very prominent. And the reason why this year was so important was because there were two big ransomware related events in this year. One was WannaCry, and it swept through computers in 150 countries. And the other one was NotPetya. And NotPetya ended up being the most, the costliest cyber attack of all time. So though common people are not aware of these names, they might not be able to tell us that it was WannaCry or NotPetya. The fact still remains that it became very, very mainstream.
It's your 15-minute.
Okay, thank you so much. So 2018, suddenly privacy came into the limelight. We were talking about how do we become compliant. We were also talking about things such as social media. Are they keeping our data as private as we would like them to? And also the whole issue of Cambridge Analytica came about. And again, there were questions about how is this data sharing impacting broader things than just technology and privacy in that context. So 2019, you would expect that we have come all this way. We have learned so much, so things would have changed. But let's look at what organizations are saying. About 6 in 10 organizations have said that they have faced a material or significant incident in the past 12 months. So there, nothing has changed. Boards lack confidence in organizations' cybersecurity. So with 50% at best saying that they are somewhat confident. So everyone else is not very confident. And 86% of organizations say that crisis prevention and compliance still remain top drivers. And if you look at that box on the right, unprepared, crisis-driven, compliance-driven, this is how we are still viewed by people who are not in cybersecurity. So what is history telling us then? Starting with as early as the early antivirus things that we installed on computers, and they slowed computers down, we've got somewhat of a reputation for being a problem with reducing productivity, and confidence in cyber capabilities continues to be very low. So as an industry, we need to be focusing on establishing cyber as a key value enabler, and definitely building relationships with the business and at the board level as well. The more we can talk about cyber, the more we can talk about how it's protecting people, the better it is for us as an industry. History is also telling us that we're still seen as a compliance activity, and budgets have been a challenge since forever. And so what we probably need to do is to evaluate the effectiveness of the CISO function and see whether we are doing the right things for the business. Are we checking boxes, or are we actually making a difference? The third thing is that cyber professionals are still seen as men in hoodies, starting with 1995 and the movie Hackers down to 2015 and the shows that are on now. We're still seen as a cliche. So we need to focus on actively building diverse teams and start talking to students in universities and schools about cyber careers. There's a lot that history teaches us, but I think in 20 minutes, that's a rapid fire run through what's happened in the last 10 years and what I have specifically learned. I think that gives us a minute for any questions or comments if we have them.
Someone asks, what about What about that many of the cyber issues from the recent years seem to come out of Ukraine?
Mhm. Yes, that is true. So it's interesting. In 2019, researchers from Google as well as IBM did a research on where are all the cyber criminals. And of course, they're concentrated in a few geographical areas. But what's interesting is they're also becoming quite professional. So just like us, they sit in organizations, they work during the week, they take holidays over the weekend. So it's very natural, I think, for us to see a more professional way of doing things and perhaps even more um, geographical areas where these might be concentrated. So
All right.
all
I think that's all the questions we have.
Is there a backstory that needs to be told? I think we've run out of time, but Tim, that's an interesting question that we can perhaps discuss at another time.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.